Reformation, assuming we get there, to the present, or more or less the present. And you see the first slide here, it says, where do we go from here? Because in some ways that is one of our objectives in studying this, is to understand not only where we've been, but where we're headed. And does it matter where we're headed? Just to bring this up to date just a little bit here, I want to start with the Reformation. You can see on your notes, the date generally given for the Protestant Reformation is 1517. Now, any good Lutheran knows, all of you will know, that is the date when Martin Luther decided to deface public property. That's the day when Luther went ahead and nailed 95 statements, many of them really being complaints about the status quo, to the castle door at Wittenberg. And that's the beginning. That's the official date that's given as the beginning of the Reformation. But like so many things in church history, so many things in history in general, it's kind of hard to say when it exactly began. Last week we talked about the date of the Great Schism, and that date was given as 864. Wait, long time. Oh my gosh, you're gonna really not talk about the final, folks. The final. Yeah. Test. 864. Typically the date is given as 1054, but it's really difficult to actually pinpoint it. There are those who say it really began 200 years earlier, and those who say, well, that was just a political date. Really, it didn't affect anything theologically for another 100 or 150 years. So, same is true of the Reformation. By the way, we give the official end of the Reformation is typically given as 1648 with something called the Peace of Westphalia. Now, those of you who are students of world history or world politics, you might know the term Westphalian. The Peace of Westphalia was a particularly important event, not only in church history, but also in the history of Western civilization. Because that is the date that's given when nations became truly sovereign. Nations were no longer under the auspices of an overlord, and a person in the West, typically of the Pope. We're actually now at a time when we are examining whether or not Westphalian governmental structures, that is to say, sovereign nations, will continue to hold political sway in the world. Back to the 16th century, I just made a list there. A week or two ago, I mentioned that people lived and died over theological issues. There's a list of wars there. I'm not going to go through all of it. It would take the rest of our time together and then some. But I just gave you that list to show you just how contentious the Reformation was. I'll also point out that most of the contention probably had little or nothing to do with people's theological perspective. That was the excuse, as religion is often used as an excuse for great evil. Religion is frequently used as an excuse, sometimes a very powerful one, for the violence that human beings create in their hearts. So here you have a list of wars that are in some way connected to whether or not particular places in Europe were going to remain Roman Catholic or become some version or other of Protestant. And if you're interested, I would invite you to look those up. I especially direct your attention to things like the 80 Years' War, or if that seems too long, the 30 Years' War. You may think that we have conflicts in our day and age that are interminable. When will we ever get out of the Middle East, for example? Consider a war that goes on 80 years, especially when a typical lifespan might have only been 40 or 50 years at the time. Consider entire generations of people who knew nothing but war. That's the post-Reformation period in Northern Europe. So, principal post-Reformation thoughts, and this is kind of important, we continue to be important for for the rest of our discussion today, just a few principal things you need to be aware of. Okay, we'll talk first about, there's our war slide. It's kind of a famous picture depicting a battle in the 80 Years' War. Very stylized, of course, but gives you some flavor for the times. I'd also like to point out the way in which battles in art are typically glorified. Do you think anybody fighting a battle in the mud, do you think look at the fellow in the gold outfit, the beautiful white horse, with his hunting dogs along there. Stood so that they got. Calvinism. That's John Calvin there, father of the decidedly radical Swiss Reformation. Calvinism is a prevailing thought of the Reformation era. A couple of things you need to know about Calvinism. Calvinism is the father or mother, if you prefer, of all of the churches that consider themselves part of the Reformed camp of Protestantism. So Calvinism is the forebearer of things like the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians. If we look at let's see where I put this. We'll get to it in a little bit, but just so you know, on page 3, there is actually a chart. It's kind of blurry, I apologize for that, but I think I did. A chart that is showing the derivation of these denominations. Few points we need to be aware about Calvinism. Theologically, John Calvin was a big proponent of grace. Grace is still a central word in any of the churches that come from Calvinist roots. Now, you might say to yourself, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? And of course, it's a good thing, but John Calvin might define grace a little bit differently than you do. For example, John Calvin might say that, well, here we have a very nice married couple. One of them is in fact a pastor, and the other one is a hyper-diligent choral singer. And, however, God, and God alone, knows which one of those two, or both, or neither, he shall impart his grace to. So, it is possible that Phyllis may be part of the elect. Phyllis could be part of the elect, and if Phyllis is part of the elect, she has absolutely nothing to worry about, because she's going to go to heaven. Okay? Now, if Pastor Al is not part of the elect, which could happen even though he's a pastor and has studied Scripture and has studied a whole bunch of theology and linguistics and all kinds of things, hermeneutics and all kinds of other complicated, hard-to-pronounce courses, he might not be part of the elect. Now, we as human beings might have some idea about that. Because if Phyllis is truly part of the elect, she will act like a person who's part of the elect. She will evidence God's grace in her life. And Pastor Al, accordingly, will not so much. Now, I'm not saying this is the case, and frankly, I don't make a very good Calvinist, so I'll just throw that whole thing away. But if you are a Calvinist, if you come from that, if you are a Presbyterian, or come from that camp, that's your theological root. Now, what's interesting is there are very few Presbyterians today who will hold to that hard-line understanding of God's grace. Why, you ask? Because it isn't very hopeful. It's hard to get people to come to church when you tell them, well, you might be saved, you might not. Well, how do I get saved? Well, you really can. God does it for you. Well, what if I say I believe in Jesus? Well, what you can be sure is if you say you don't believe in Jesus, you're definitely not saved. But just because you say you believe in Jesus doesn't mean you're really saved, because maybe you don't. Maybe you only believe it with your head, not your heart. Maybe you have some doubts. Maybe you don't believe in the right way. You see, only God can give you the grace to truly believe. And that's kind of hardline, old school Calvinism. And by the way, some of those thoughts in disguise still hold sway in all of Christendom. Partly because the thoughts are, at least indirectly, derived, or Calvinists would say very directly derived from biblical principles, and partly because of something we'll talk about, a word you're going to be sick of hearing after today, cross-pollination. Kind of like the flowers. What's with religions? Okay, that brings us to Lutheranism. We've already talked about Lutheranism at great length. Okay, we know about our man Marty. Went ahead and nailed those statements to the door. Nailed those statements to the door in 1517. Had no intention of starting a religious revolution, by the way. His hope, perhaps futile, but nonetheless his hope was that people upstairs, or over the water in Rome, would say, oh, gee, that German priest is right. We ought to pay attention. That didn't happen. Originally what happened is people discovered that it was far more to their advantage to create a new religion. By the way, one where you didn't have to pay taxes to a faraway place. Not that we think like that, right? Okay, so that brings us to something called the Counter-Reformation. Counter-Reformation on page 2. Roman Catholicism responded, depending on your point of view, either very well or very poorly to the actions of the Protestant reformers, but either way they responded strongly. They kind of dug their heels in. For example, where Protestants began to say things like, gee, maybe we shouldn't spend all this money on building huge cathedrals. Maybe that money ought to go to the pastor's salary. No, it ought to go to helping the poor. The Roman Catholics built bigger and more elaborate cathedrals, where Protestants said, hey, maybe our worship really shouldn't be so complex. Maybe our worship should be easier to understand. Roman Catholics developed even more elaborate and ornate ceremony. It is, by the way, during this time, here you go, this by the way is an example. This is, anybody know? Thank you, yes, that's the cathedral in Rome. This is, any ideas? This is a place near and dear to my heart in my hometown of New York City. This is the interior of St. Patrick's Cathedral, as seen when you come indoors, straight down the aisle. Examples of ornate, elaborate, decidedly beautiful Roman Catholic architecture. To a certain extent, in response to the other side of the religious world that says, hey, wait a minute, we don't need all that stuff. Okay, moving along just a little bit here. The Eucharist. We've been talking a lot about the Eucharist. If we had a lot more time, I would do this in greater depth. Some of you would talk about wanting to have some of these topics kind of encapsulated in unique studies. In reality, it is my belief that the history of worship is in fact tantamount to the history of the Eucharist, or the other way around. Because regardless of your perspective on the Eucharistic action, that is the event that defines us. That is the event where we recall, one way or another, what happened to Jesus. We are, as Christians, called by his name. Now, there are those who say, well, no, actually, baptism is more important because baptism is how you get in church, and all kinds of things, and, I won't necessarily argue that point. However, I will suggest that as worship forms changed, typically at the heart of that change has been human beings understanding of what it is we're actually doing in the Eucharist. Okay, just first terms I want to clarify. Okay, we talked about some of this last week. Transubstantiation. Transubstantiation literally means taking this thing over here, and turning it into this. For example, I could, transubstantiate path into the tree that it came from. Well, I wish I could do that. An environmentalist might, I actually can't do that. An environmentalist probably wishes I could do that too, because I use a lot of paper. But that would be transubstantiation. Physically taking this piece of paper and turning it into something else. By the way, it doesn't have to be related, like paper to tree. I could turn this piece of paper into water or a rock, and it would be transubstantiated. Now, that's a shade of difference. Some say it's just a split hair of difference between another Eucharistic doctrine called real presence, also sometimes called spiritual union. And that is the prevailing Eucharistic doctrine among Lutherans. What's the difference? In transubstantiation, the priest says, "This is the body and blood of Christ," and it becomes that. Even though it still looks like a little tiny wafer and a cup of wine. That's the doctrine. It goes from this to this. It is transubstantiated. Now, the Lutheran understanding, I've actually had people laugh when I try to describe this, because to some people it makes no sense. Or at least why it's different makes no sense. You see, the Lutheran understanding is not that it is changed at a particular point, but rather the body and the blood of Christ are present, really present, we get the term real presence from, really present in and under and over and through, and a lot of other prepositions, the physical elements of bread and wine. Just to clarify, by the way, that is not to be confused, please, with another term, consubstantiation. Someone asked about consubstantiation last week. Consubstantiation is sometimes wrongly employed in talking about what the Lutheran view of the Eucharist is. That's not to say there are no Lutherans who believe in consubstantiation. I happen to know a whole lot of Lutherans who believe in transubstantiation. But consubstantiation, technically speaking, means that the body and blood of Christ exist alongside the bread and wine. Have you caught the shades of difference there? Okay. The first one, transubstantiation, is turned into. The second one, they exist in and among, inextricably woven together, if you will. And finally, in consubstantiation, well, you've got the bread and wine here, and somehow, invisibly, mystically, you've got Jesus over here. Now, that's, again, a shade of difference. And if you're sitting there thinking, gee, oh, this is just so picky and so, maybe you're in a good place. Because, by the way, it's pretty much the place where the church was for the first several hundred years of its existence. Finally, we get to memorialism. Memorialism is the prevailing view of the Reformed churches, which, by the way, is most of Protestant Christendom. Memorialism, and I could fill all these pages with variations on memorialism. But to really simplify memorialism is exactly as the name implies. They hearken to Jesus saying, "Do this in remembrance." Thank you. Okay? So that's it. Jesus gets together with his disciples, and he's trying to give them an object lesson, so he takes a piece of bread, and he breaks it up and says, "This is my body." Targeting the fact that his own body is about to be broken, effectively. And then he drinks the cup, or he takes the cup and passes it to them, and says, "This is my blood shed for you." The understanding of memorialism is that's what it is. Jesus said, "Do it." We do it in remembrance of him. Now, that is not to say that people who are memorialists in their understanding are without a spiritual connection. And trust me, that I have been in Presbyterian and Congregationalist and Baptist churches where they will claim the idea of memorialism as a theology and yet treat the Eucharistic elements with at least as much respect as any high church Anglican you could ever hope to meet. So these are three views of what's happening with the Eucharist. I'm going to stop here. I know I've been somewhat remiss in asking about questions, but partly it's in light of self-interest. I need to give my voice a rest here, because otherwise you won't hear anything I'm saying. I don't know if it's bad, you won't. So let me ask you if you have any questions. Questions at this point? Yes, sir.
Currently, Lutheran theologians, they maintain the real presence, not consubstantiation.
That is correct in conservative Lutheran churches, Missouri Synod, Wisconsin Synod, and so forth. Things get to be up for grabs when you start moving to the left. There are a number of viewpoints that are put up.
Because I was brought up in Lutheran church.
Sure.
At that point, it was consubstantiation.
You know, it's kind of interesting. Although there are Lutherans and maybe entire Lutheran church bodies that do hold to consubstantiation, in reality, consubstantiation has never actually been, at the risk of being contentious, has never actually been an official doctrine of the Lutheran Church. So there are one of two possibilities. One, you were part of one of those unique and oddball churches. And if that's the case, congratulations. We got to tell us. Or, more likely, whomever it was that said it to you got it wrong, because it's such a shade of difference that the term is frequently misapplied. In fact, if you were at a cocktail party, by the way, if you're a Presbyterian or Baptist, you shouldn't be at a cocktail party, but I guess it's okay if you're a Lutheran. If you were at a cocktail party, and someone starts talking to you about Eucharistic theology, if that's the case, I have no idea what kind of cocktail parties you go to. But if this happens, and they start talking to you, oh, you're a Lutheran, you guys believe in consubstantiation. If I were you, I'd just drop it. Unless you, no, thank you so much. Anyway, it is easily misapplied because the shade. You know, I've also heard people say, "Oh yeah, Lutherans, you guys are like Catholics. You believe in transubstantiation." And in all honesty, depending on how deeply I want to get involved in it, I might, as likely as not, say, "Yeah, something like that," because it is something like that. Which is, I guess, a pretty good segue into the next topic. So, there it is, bold-faced prayer, page 2. What is worship? What is worship?
Praising God.
Praising God, okay. All right, what else? Other comments? Worship.
Well, you can worship anything, I mean.
Yeah, I guess you could. People worship their homes, people worship their pocketbooks, people worship their bank accounts, people worship their politicians sometimes. Not so much nowadays, no. People worship golden calves of various kinds, automobiles, and jewelry, and houses, and things like that. Sure. What else? Anything else? Worship?
We're forgiven for our sins of the past week or so.
I'm sorry, what was that?
We're forgiven for our sins.
Forgiven for our sins. Okay. So, what I hear you saying is that worship is connected with coming to this place when we have assurance that our sins are forgiven. Is that? Okay. Yes?
It's fellowship with God.
Fellowship with God. Okay. That's an interesting thought. Fellowship with God. That's good. Yeah. Okay, so worship, hard to define, right? Like a lot of things, hard to define. What I want to do is take a look at a word here. Liturgy. And liturgy comes, and this is, historically we've talked about our worship service. Our worship service in kind of church geek speak is liturgy. It's, in Greek, by the way, it's, Yeah. There you go. Or as one of my profs would have said with his heavy this is, now what's interesting about this, if we look at this word, a little etymological study here. Now I was taught as well, that liturgy means work of the people. That's what they always told me. Work of the people. And that's typically what pastors tell their congregations. Liturgy means work of the people. It's the things that we do before God. And that makes sense, right? We come to church and we sing hymns, and we sing the hymns or songs about and to God. And we receive our forgiveness, somebody said, from God. And then we acknowledge that with thankfulness back to God. And then what else was it? We fellowship with God. But what's interesting about this is that if we were to actually look at this word in its actual context, we discover it means something slightly different. Actually, the word in its first century application means public work. Let me try to explain that a little bit. I'll try at least. Rome, like every nation, needed to support itself. It had a whole lot of pork barrel projects it needed to take care of. So how do they support? How does the government get money? What's happening on April 15th? Something I do that before the right center. Okay. Right, taxes. So the government collected taxes. But what's interesting about Rome is that they kind of had what we might think of as an inverted tax system. You see, right now, our taxation system, which if you make a really little bit of money, you pay nothing. Well, you actually still do, because you still pay sales tax when there was a sales tax. You pay tax on gasoline and things like that. But your income tax, if you're really kind of in the lower margins, your income tax is, nothing. And the more you make, percentage-wise, the more you pay. By the way, if you are approaching that tax bracket, just keep in mind that it's right now nothing compared to what it had been decades ago. As much as you might think it's excessive. Rome had a tendency to do the opposite. Rome tended to tax its poorer people most heavily. And the richer you got, the less you paid. And I think the reasoning went something like this. Well, if I take 10% of a rich man's salary, that's a lot of money. But if I take 10% of a poor man's salary, that's almost nothing. Therefore, in order to get the poor to pay their share, we'll tax the poor 60 or 70%, and then to be equitable, we'll only tax the rich 2 or 3%. You like that idea?
Some that would like that idea.
My suspicion is if you like that idea, you would be unwilling to admit it. Rome had this kind of inverted tax system. But if you were really, really wealthy, as in aristocracy, it was considered unseemly to pay taxes at all. You see, when you were really rich, like, Zuckerberg rich, or Bill Gates rich, that kind of rich, you didn't pay taxes at all. And I suppose the social theory behind it was that would be kind of like the emperor hitting his buddies up for money. He just didn't do that. Instead, what was done is that the very, very wealthy had imposed upon them a liturgy, a public service that rotated from household to household, a public work that they had to perform. In other words, there's going to be a big ceremony. So we're going to go over here and we're going to go to the bachelor residence. Okay, on the 3rd of Janus, we're having a big ceremony. It's up to you to make it happen. Thanks. And the bachelor residence not wanting to be outdone, by the human residents that just had that ceremony last month, they would go and they would try to one-up them. Liturgy, public work. Now, why is that important? Because, as we'll see in a little while, it plays into the idea of what it is we're actually doing when we do worship. For example, one of the things that I'll talk about in just a few moments are changing worship styles. And we're all aware of the fact that the way we worship now, almost in any church, is not the way we did when we were kids. Okay? When I was growing up, and I wasn't always a liturgical scholar, I started young, but not that young. When I was growing up, I pretty much assumed that there were two ways you could worship. On page 5 or page 15. And I think it was something like page 32 or something when a layperson did it, and then they did Mass. And that was it. That was what you did in worship. And there was always an organ that was way in the back, that was played very, very, very slowly. And there was always a choir in the front that had a repertoire of about 7 pieces. And that's what we did. That was it. And if you're Roman Catholic, and if you're, shall we say, at a certain age, then you might be aware that there was a time when worship was not something you necessarily expected to even understand. Because it was in a language you didn't regularly speak. Sure, if you went to Catholic school, they would give you a few years of Latin, and they would even point out, well, that's what this means. That would be as far as it got. And there'd be lots and lots and lots of things that you couldn't necessarily memorize or wouldn't even know unless you decided to become a Latin scholar. And frankly, for a lot of people, that was okay because that was worship. Nowadays, if I said to a Roman Catholic, well, your church is now going to be, everything's going to be in Latin now. Everything's going to be in Latin. That's how it is. Chances are they would say, well, that's it, I'm not going to church. Or we'll go find some other church. There are people in this congregation who have said, if we don't have contemporary music, I'm going somewhere else. Conversely, there are people who have said, if we don't play the organ, I think they'll go somewhere else. Worship wars. I hope it doesn't become a war, although it certainly has in other places. But the question is, if it's all about God, if it's all about what we do for God, why are we so concerned with how it suits us? You know, we talk a lot about the worship being meaningful. But it seems to me, if it's the first thing, the work of the people, we want to be concerned, as odd as it sounds, that the worship is actually meaningful to God. Just a thought. Now, we're talking about worship here, we've got a lot into history and so forth. I have a little hypothesis that I'd like to share with you. A little hypothesis. And I can't prove it. It's not uniquely mine. I've written a lot of papers on it. Other people have written a lot of papers on it. No one can probably really prove this. We just give examples. And it goes like this. The higher the level of mystery, or to use a different word, transcendence in your theology. In other words, the more mystery there is in your theology, the more complex, the more mysterious, or the higher church your worship is. On the other hand, the more angulinear your theology, the more exact, the more you believe that you can come to a cognitive understanding of God, or at least man's place in relationship to God, the more imminent your sense of God, and the more imminent your worship will be. Are there exceptions? Probably, at least as many as there are rules. But case in point, Eastern Orthodox theology is all about transcendence. Eastern Orthodox theology and Eastern Orthodox worship hasn't changed substantially since 1054. There have been a few tweaks here and there, but for the most part, it's the same church that it was 1,000 years ago. As a result, their worship is complex. In fact, if you read your homework assignment, you'll realize on that complicated looking chart I gave you that from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, it is impossible for a human being to ever come to actual knowledge of God. As a result, Eastern Orthodox adherents typically talk about their 7 sacraments as mysteries. An Eastern Orthodox person has little or no interest in the mechanics of transubstantiation because they would look at you and say with a straight face, obviously there's no way a mortal can understand how this bread and wine turns into the body of Jesus. But it does. Just like we can't understand the way Jesus took a couple of loaves of fish and fed 5,000 people with it. So, what I'd like to suggest as we run through the gamut of worship practice, theologies, and denominations, we will discover that the more complex, the more mysterious your understanding, the more you're likely to have a worship style that is full of complexity, full of mystery. Again, in the Orthodox Church, the Eucharistic presentation takes place behind a screen called iconostasis. Up until fairly recently, Second Vatican Council recently, Roman Catholic priests presided over the Eucharist and said most of their prayers like this. Mystery. What's going on there? It doesn't matter. Suffice it to say something is. We might account for Lutheran positioning on this issue. Some people say, oh yeah, Lutheran, that's almost like Catholic. Well, it kind of is. We have Mass, of course, depending on what synod you're in, you might not like to call it that, but that's what it is. It's the Roman Rite, by the way, which was stabilized in the Counter-Reformation. We have liturgy. We have the Eucharist we believe to be the real presence. That's kind of somewhere in the middle of the Roman Catholic Church or the Reformed churches. As a result, our worship style, at least up until relatively recently, tended to be somewhere in the middle. We weren't as low church, I'll find those terms in a minute, as, say, the Congregationalists. But praise be to God, we weren't as high church as some from Rome or Constantinople. Oh, just a theory for you, can't prove it. We'll move along here. Page 3, here's your chart of denominations. Go through this really quickly. Lutheranism we talked about, Calvinism we talked about, Anglicanism. A political movement, remember I saw one. We did talk about that, right? King Henry VIII, he wants a son, well, he wants a legitimate son. You know, God may have a sense of humor. All of his mistresses, and he had a few, had no problem bearing this man a son. All kinds of so-called illegitimate children. His legitimate wives, and then he could only have one at a time, even though he was king. Daughters. Girls. Chicks. What's he going to do with that? Anyway, you know the story. Henry, this is the Pope. You're the defender of the faith. That's your title as king. You can't keep divorcing, or you cannot keep executing your wives. It's unseemly. Okay, Your Holiness, grant me divorce. Henry, doesn't work that way. No divorce for you. I'll start my own church where I can do it. Grotesque oversimplification, you betcha. But that's the important part that you want to remember from the title party. Okay, Anabaptists. Kind of interesting place here. Let's see. Is it through? There we go. Here he is. Leos. The Anabaptists, we talked about the Reformation as something which is sort of bicornual. You had the German side, you had the Swiss side. You had a little offshoot in Anglicanism. Prior, or well, almost prior to this kind of thinking, there was a movement. There was a movement to reform the church. Remember how I said that Luther was the first reformer, not the first reformer, but the first reformer to gain a large following without coming up dead? Well, here we have Mendelssohn who did not gain a large following. However, he gained an important following. There's a whole lot you can read about Anabaptists. I don't want to take too much time because we've got a lot to cover here. But here's how it works. Anabaptists may be the first people who officially tried to craft the doctrine of what Luther is disparagingly referred to as decision theology. Works like this. We baptize infants in the Catholic Church. We baptize infants in the Orthodox Church. Long history of baptizing infants. Now, Mendel comes along and his followers, and they say, what's that about? How do they baptize a baby? A baby has no cognition to say, I believe in Jesus. A baby can't make that decision for his or herself. Therefore, we're not going to baptize babies. This should sound familiar to somebody. We're not going to baptize babies. Instead, we're going to wait until people reach an age where they're literate, but they're capable of making their own decision. The enemies of, called this movement Anabaptists. Now, Anabaptists is translated two ways. Sometimes people say Anabaptist means no baptism, but if we were to look at it a little more closely, it actually means over-baptism, as in baptizing someone over again. And that's what his enemies, his theological enemies, said he did. Somebody who was baptized already, as a Lutheran or as a Catholic, most likely a Catholic at this time, as you can see, as a child, as an infant, he says, no, that's not good enough. I'll baptize you again. Mayo said, no, we're not Anabaptists. We don't want to be that. We're just Christians. We're not baptizing people over again. That infant baptism made without decision isn't valid. So that gives rise, if you're wondering, the descendants of the Anabaptists. There on page 4 you can see Amish. Ever wonder what Amish believe in? Besides horse and buggies? And making appliances and so forth? Amish, Hutterites, Mennonites, Brethren, Ruderhoff, the Apostolic Christian Church, all are derivatives of Mennonite theology, of Anabaptist theology. Talk a little bit about Presbyterianism. I like this line because I worked in a few Presbyterian churches. This is very familiar to me. This is a Presbyterian Lord's table. And please note the absence of paraments or of fairlinen. Sometimes you see a fairlinen on a Presbyterian altar, but not all that frequently. You'll also notice the pottery pattern and chalice. That's not obligatory, but it is a trend in the Presbyterian Church towards kind of the earthy, almost shamanistic nature of Christ's ministry. Presbyterian Church, you can see that there on your notes, branch of Reformed Protestantism, goes back to the British Isles, most notably Scotland. If you are of Scottish descent, by the way, at some point in your family, you were probably Presbyterian. For some reasons. Presbyterian simply means rule by elders, from the Greek, presbyteros. Presbyterian theology, typically in modern times, emphasizes the sovereignty of God, the authority of Scriptures, and there's that word again, necessity of grace. Well, what do I have there? Okay, there we go. Congregationalism. I think a typical Congregationalist church, I guess it looks kind of elaborate in some way. I found one with some snow on it to make me feel at home, or at least to make me feel a little cooler or something, I don't know. But there it is, typical Congregational church. It might look kind of pretty to our eyes, but contrast that, and remember, to the picture of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, or the interior of the Cathedral of St. Patrick. So, Congregationalists, by the way, typically didn't call these things churches. Church meant the body of Christ, the people, in their minds. That's what a meeting house. No temple, no sacred ground, just a place you got together and meet. Some congregations still refer to their buildings as meeting houses. Again, lots you can read about that. Lots you can read about congregationalism. Let me suggest this. Congregationalism comes out of the separatist and Puritan movements. Congregationalism is something of a unique and American phenomenon, touched by American ideas on politics. Who's the boss in say, Episcopal Church? Who makes the decisions? The bishop. And it says the name, right? Yeah, the bishop of the Episcopal Church. Now, local issues, priests can have some say, and I guess the vestry gets to have some say. Okay, here's a loaded question. Who makes the decisions in the Lutheran Church? None of you all know what to say, are you? Well, the Lutheran Church, right, we have a church council, and we have a pastor, and we have a congregational president, and we have a head elder, and we have a board of elders, and we also have a church constitution. And I will tell you that there is a synodical policy on this. Individual districts have their own ideas on it. Individual congregations have their own ideas on this. I will not quote that to you right now because I need to leave here in one piece. However, I will suggest to you that I have been in churches where the pastor was, dare I say, parapastoral, if you know what I mean. I have also been in churches where the pastor was, well, you might as well just call this guy father figure, because he was just a figurehead. Church council decided everything. Well, in the Congregationalist church, they do everything by voting. The congregation votes, and by the way, the congregations are autonomous, which kind of makes for some interesting polity and theology, because Congregationalist churches have voted themselves into union with congregations that have opposing is a nasty word, but differing theologies. For example, studying at something called the Institute for Peace Theology in Lancaster County, I would have to drive every Monday night from Jersey to all these kind of winding Pennsylvania roads. And one of the landmarks that I always passed, I was only about an hour away from where I had to be, was a Union church. It was a Lutheran Congregationalist Union church. Because at some point, the Congregationalist church, as it was dwindling, voted to say, let's join up with those Lutherans. Well, what about the fact that they have a different theology of the Eucharist? We'll live. What about all that liturgy stuff they do? And chancel practicing? They're practically Catholics, those Lutherans. We'll live. The congregation could vote to do what it wanted. Because I do wonder what would happen if the congregation of the church voted to become part of the Missouri Synod Church. An interesting thought, isn't it? Okay. Baptists. How many Baptists here? Baptists? A lot of Baptists, right? Okay. Yeah, this is the South. Some of it feels like New York because everybody's going on everybody. Almost everybody has a New York accent, some kind of accent. But it is the South, and Baptists, big in the South, developed for the most part independently of the Anabaptists. Okay? Anabaptists did not give rise to the Baptist church. It's not like they said that they were Anabaptists, Anabaptists is too hard to pronounce. Let's just cut the Ana part off and call ourselves Baptists. And it's not quite how it happened. Anabaptists, coming still out of the Reformed camp. However, not unlike the Mennonites and all their cousins, decision theology. No infant baptism. You decide to follow Jesus. By the way, Baptists typically have a memorialist viewpoint on the Eucharist. Let's see. Methodism. Charles and John Wesley. Charles Wesley, Anglican priest. is decides the church is way too secular. Decides the church is way too worldly. Decides that, you know what? All this stuff about atonement, all this stuff about forgiveness of sins, didn't Jesus do that already? Now Jesus has told us to follow him, to live the way he does. Basic thrust of Wesley's message: live a life of love. Live a life that emulates Jesus. Why are they called Methodists? I wish there was a better reason. Because Wesley came up with a method that he published of following Jesus. Once again, it was originally kind of a disparaging term. Oh, you people are Methodists. Just like Lutheran, by the way. Lutheran. Kind of a term of disparagement. Oh, you're the followers of Luther. Okay. One other thing I need to point out here. Something unique about the Methodist Church, at least it's unique among the Reformed groupings. Methodists were very strong on the idea that Jesus' atoning sacrifice was for everybody, not just the elect. Now, I think I mentioned in your notes that there are such a thing as Calvinist Methodists. But for the most part, Methodists believe that salvation was potentially open to everyone. Interestingly enough, some Roman Catholics frequently pray that hell may be empty. Interesting thought. A few concepts for you. We've got high church, we've got low church. You've heard those terms before. What is high church? Fancy robes. So if you got plain robes here, you're not in church? What if you just show up in a bathrobe? No.
That's the low church.
That's really low church. Now this is Florida. For all I know, there are like special Anglican high church flip-flops around here. I don't know. I'm still getting used to the whole Florida culture thing, guys. High church. For our purposes, I'd like to define high church as the amount of mystery that's present in the worship. The amount of mystery. The amount of transcendental symbolism. So what does high church look like? A worship service that engages the senses in ways that are not necessarily prevalent in the common culture. So, for example, a church that is having a true high church worship service, you will generally not find anything that looks or sounds like popular music. You will not find artwork that looks like advertisements. For the most part, you probably won't find projectors. What you will find music that may be at this point alien to common culture, classical music, often very old classical music, smells. Incense is often a big part of high church worship service. We're engaging all of the senses. Every Orthodox church uses a lot of incense, typically. Some Roman Catholic churches do. It's all called high mass. Sights, those robes you talked about. Visual sights, a kind of clothing that not only do people not wear, it's entirely impractical to wear on the street. High church. Low church, limited or no mystery. And it's the difference between, do we see God as transcendent? And this is, if you can't remember anything else, this is probably what you remember. Because this is a crucial question that has no definite answer, but I believe is important that we keep in the foreground of our thoughts as Christians. Is God transcendent? Is God so big that we cannot grasp him, or some say, her, it, so tiny as to fit in the space between atoms, and be both at once. That's transcendence. Or at least it's one definition of transcendence. Or is God immanent? Right here. Right now. He walks with me and he talks with me. He tells me that I am his own. God going for a walk in the cool of the evening. The immanent God. High church versus low church. I'm going to rush past atonement and salvation because it's a 5-week course unto itself. The one I do need to. Oh, by the way, there's your robes. There are your robes. Kind of typical high church. That is actually an Anglo-Catholic worship service. What is Anglo-Catholic? Well, our running joke in the trade, so to speak, is they're Episcopalians who think they're more Catholic than the Pope. Okay, here we go. This is an important word for you. Cross-pollination. What's cross-pollination? If you're a botanist, please don't give me an answer, it'll take too long. In language terms, what's cross-pollination?
Mixing.
Yeah. Cross-pollination, ladies and gentlemen, is what's happening at Faith Viera. Cross-pollination is what's happening in churches throughout Central Florida. Cross-pollination is what's happening in churches all over the place. This past Sunday, we did a song that I thought you all would know. It didn't. Most of you. And it actually was written by a Catholic nun. And some of you went, yeah, that's why I didn't know it. It's a kind of Catholic song you're putting on this crazy northeasterner. We did a song that's really coming out of very much decision theology. We did a modern composition by a Lutheran who became Greek Orthodox. And we did a lot of Presbyterian stuff. Cross-pollination is what happens. Cross-pollination is the way American Christianity is. And then finally, I want to give you another word. Populism. What's populism?
Whatever's happening now.
Very good, yeah. Populism, as a political term, means bending to the will of the people. And as much as we hate to admit it, populism is how the church as a whole, over the long haul, has tended to do its theology. For example, at one point, in the early Christian church, when you went to take communion, you would receive what? A piece of bread and some wine. Until the theology of the church heaped so much mystery upon those actions that people were afraid. And they stopped coming to communion. The Pope had to say, okay, if you don't come to communion at least once a year, you're not a Christian anymore. People still stay away and say, I'll take my chances. This communion stuff, eating, drinking, damnation unto thyself, sounds pretty scary. I'll take my chance of being a pagan. So they made a compromise. Okay, if you only have to take the bread when you come back, well, I'll think about it. Populism. There's absolutely no theological reason for that. There's no theological reason to change that after about 900 years. Populism. We do theology by populism. Okay, we'll talk really quickly about what's happening now. Fundamentalism. What's fundamentalism?
Hey, you guys got my tie on.
What's that?
I got a tie just like that.
definition of fundamentalism, lifted by LaMort, right in the paper that I wrote. Fundamentalism is essentially, to boil it down, you believe that everything is fundamental. All the scriptures. It's all fundamental. It's all of co-equal importance. Yes, Jesus died for your sins, that's important, but following the letter of the law is also important. And that's a very sloppy definition of fundamentalism. I invite you to read the paper for a more thorough one. That's essentially what we have. And fundamentalism, by the way, is growing. While mainline Christian churches are beginning to decline, statistically, maybe not here in Central Florida, that's pretty good churches here, but across the board, remember, I'm coming out of a place where we could hit triple digits. We were doing pretty well. Triple digits across all the services the other weekend. Fundamentalism, on the other hand, is growing. That brings us to, what? Whatever. I don't know if this is a 5-hour course. Okay. Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism, another growing phenomenon. Primarily an American phenomenon, but now worldwide. Actually particularly big, at least its charismatic cousins are very big in Asia, Australia, not so much in Europe, although there are some inroads. Charismaticism, like Pentecostalism, is a belief that the supernatural gifts of the Spirit were not just for the early church. So, for example, a charismatic or Pentecostal, and I really shouldn't lump those two things together because they are different, but you can read the details of it on your own, will believe that just as people could prophesy in the first century and before, so there can be prophets today. Just as people could do miraculous healings in the early church, so they can today. Just as people could speak in and interpret other unlearned languages in the early church, so they can today. And on goes the list. Charismatic and Pentecostal worship are typically marked by experience. This may be in some ways, but not in all ways, the extreme, the immanence of God. God is so present that He will affect our behavior in radical ways right now. Another movement growing, like wildfire in Christian church. Here's what I want to do. I want you to look at page 8, please. Go back to cross-pollination. And I want to give us a really quick, so you can stop listening to my voice, a really quick survey of church music over 1,000 years. You ready for this? Let's see how this is going to work. Over the magic device. Potentially another kind of idol, by the way. And this is probably what church music sounded like at the time of the Great Schism. We can't know for certain. There were no record players or phonographs or recording devices. Listening to right now is a recording of what's called Byzantine chant. It is a kind of worship that's typically done to this day in Eastern Orthodox churches. Byzantine, unlike Gregorian chant, that you're more familiar with, Byzantine chant is marked by two characteristics. One, it is not typically in Latin. It could be, but it is often in the language of a particular ethnic group of church. So, for example, if you go to an Assyrian Orthodox church, the chant would probably be in Syriac. If you go to a Greek Orthodox church, the chant will likely be in Greek and so forth and so on. Other defining characteristics which will only be meaningful to you if you're a musician, you might note a kind of odd Eastern Orthodox person will tell you that this is how it has been since the beginning. An Orthodox priest might go out on a limb and tell you this is probably how they worshipped in the early days of Christianity. As a musicologist, I'm not sure I believe that. Because things change, things evolve, even within the same genre. However, this is probably the closest picture we're going to get of early Christian worship. I want to move to the period right before the Reformation. And by the way, in the Roman Catholic Church, overlapping the Reformation and honoring the Counter-Reformation. If you want to know, when Martin Luther made the statements, why should the devil have all the good songs? Well, we know that he was talking about the good songs. He was talking about the stuff you did in the beer halls, the stuff you did in the marketplaces. Why not take that music and use that to worship God? You know, I'm not sure I want to admit it, and some of you might not either, but if Martin Luther went to this congregation, he'd probably go to the Saturday service. And because he played the ancestor of the guitar, he'd probably want to start his own praise band. And he'd probably use the stuff on whatever the local top 40 radio station is and put God lyrics to it. Maybe. But this is the stuff that Martin Luther said was no good. Text that you would find in a Marian devotion. In other words, a prayer to Mary. Just after the Reformation, congregational hymns. How do we get 150, 200, 300,000 of our friends together to sing a song? Remember, most of these people were, unlike Luther, not musically educated. Most of them do not read music. Hank showed me a hymnal from not quite that era, but 1936, I believe, is the date. It's one of these wonderful old hymnals. It's just a bunch of texts in them. No music. Why? Because music takes up space. This one's easy to put in your lapel pocket. Also, doesn't daunt people who can't read music. They just look at the words. This is what it probably sounded like, just after the Reformation. This was actually first introduced in the church probably sometime after the Reformation period, but nonetheless, this is the kind of thing they did. You'll probably recognize this too. We'll sing this in a little while. Probably will sound like this. Century. talk to contemporary Christian music people, the kind of folks who are either very dedicated to contemporary Christian music as a form of worship, or who in fact play in contemporary Christian bands, they tend to lump everything prior to 1980 into the realm of old music. So the hymn I'm about to play for you is about as different and as night and day from the previous hymn. But from the contemporary music point of view, it's all the same thing. But that's okay, because people who are very dedicated to classical music as a worship form typically lump all contemporary music in the same category as well. In some cases, both groups using words that cannot be repeated in a sanctuary. 19th century. Now, the term modern is an interesting thing. The term modern is, I want to play you an example of a modern hymn in a moment. When some of you will know. It's a hymn that actually found its way as a score for a couple of movies. It was covered by a progressive rock band. At least one person in this group might immediately know what I'm talking about. Actually was written originally as a unison choral anthem by an English composer, an Anglican composer. Became a hymn. It's actually in one of our hymnal supplements, if I'm not mistaken. This is what is considered a modern hymn. Some of you will recognize this. Let me take you to the late 1960s. Some of this will be familiar to you. So it's a Wednesday evening Lenten service. And he decides that our closing hymn is going to be said, Pass It On. Okay? Now, let's see, I graduated from high school, yes, I should tell you, in 1986 is when I graduated from high school. You do that. So this was probably 1983 or 1984. Okay? Now, teenagers were listening to something called heavy metal at the time. Well, something that they were listening to what I guess might still barely have been We still call that stuff disco then. No, disco was already dead by then. At any rate, one of our elders interrupts the pastor between verses. Actually interrupts him. Slams the book shut and says, "What kind of garbage is this? Is this some kind of newfangled thing the kids are singing now?" And why do I tell you this story? Because by the time this is 1983, let's say, for argument's sake, that song is 15, 20 years old by then. But from the mind of somebody who only knew page 5 and 15, and Evers Eliason, how's that for a name of an elder? Evers Eliason, God rest his soul. I'm going to have, remind me to cut out the tape, by the way. Evers Eliason, no, seriously. I can't afford another lawsuit. Evers Eliason knew page 5 and 15. And to his credit, he also had memorized both small and large catechisms. I tell you, when you were an elder in those days. So a little more recent. Some of you will recognize this. sorry guys, hokey version of the passed on. I'm starting to get a little bop factor going. Some of you all bop to, it only takes a spark. I won't call you out, I promise. But I know you won't. By the time I get to days of Elijah, I'm sorry folks, I got septuagenarians and octogenarians going bop, bop, bop. You all be rocking here. But the reverse reaction would probably be true if I gave this study in the middle of New York City or somewhere in North Jersey. So that brings us to the next question. Is everything that's contemporary good? And is everything that's traditional bad?
No.
And maybe more to the point, in view of our understanding of what the purpose of worship is, how do we define good and bad? I just asked the same question. And a question like this I suppose I'm being a little self-serving here, but I did have to ask the question, the next one there, is there a place for dinosaurs on the ark? Church music is changing. Church worship is changing. It's unlikely in my lifetime, or yours, the way I feel, some of you may live quite a lot longer than I will, but still, it's unlikely we're going back to Palestrina, or even Bob. The question is, someone says, is there a place for dinosaurs on the ark? Yeah, the caption which I managed in my technological lack of savvy to cut off, read something like that expletive deleted. That was today, wasn't it? And one more, Mr. and Mrs. Dinosaur, did you even look at the date on the tickets? So, the question is there a place for dinosaurs? Is there a place for dinosaurs? Wait, I
I hope so.
There's one more dinosaur slide. Tia really likes this picture because I was about 7 years younger and about 100 pounds lighter or something like that. But you can see the resemblance, right? Is there a place for dinosaurs in Christian worship today? And will the pendulum ever swing the other way around? Where are we going? One more example. This is what happens when we try to cross-pollinate. Some of you are going to love this, some of you are going to hate it. This is an example of cross-pollination. Let's see. Let's go here. I did pick that for a reason. The instrumentation is obviously modern. Maybe you know the artist? David Crowder, by the way. There's a lot of stuff that's more worship-based than entertainment-based, although he's apparently quite clear at it. I believe he played the Sonata Convention one year from Zurich. Anyway, the tune. The tune itself, that some of you at least will recognize as a hymn, goes back at least to the 17th century. So the tune predates Johann Sebastian Bach. The text is a poetic transliteration of the prayer of St. Francis. So, Middle Ages. Set to modern instrumentation. Cross-pollination. Not the only kind of cross-pollination, but one example. Which brings me to the last question. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Prayer, confess, and live.
Lex orandi, lex credendi, lex videndi.
Are we going
What?
back to Greek?
Latin, actually, and what we pray is what we believe, or maybe more accurately translated confess, but yes, believe, from credo, I believe. What we believe is how we live. And that's why this entire study is important. It is beyond the scope of this course, or maybe any course, to try to come up with succinct answers. As a matter of fact, I go so far as to say it may be a heresy to try to come up with exact answers. Because yesterday's contemporary is today's antiquarian curiosity. On the other hand, we can see by that last example, much is taken from the past and transmitted to the future. For anyone to try to put a limit on the way the Spirit works might indeed be the greatest of heresies. To say God can't use a guitar, or God will never again use a pipe organ. God may choose to use things that are not invented yet. I'm not that old a guy, and as a teenager, just becoming interested in some of this and considering a career, I shouldn't use that word, but here it was, in ministry. Even then, I would not have imagined big screen TV. Well, they hadn't invented big screen TVs yet. On the wall in Lenten Church. That was an awesome kid. The question continues to be important because how we pray, or what we pray, affects what we believe. If we pray, God, I want you to smite all of my enemies. And we pray that with deep conviction. Does it mean that God will smite all our enemies? No, it means that after a particular period of time, we'll begin to believe in a God whose business it is to smite enemies. If all of our worship is about transcendence, we will ultimately understand God who is transcendent, or approximate understanding, for who can understand transcendence. On the other hand, all of our worship is about a God who is immanent. We may start to do some things like some kids at Salvation Army Citadel, where I worked for a little while, once did. They came into the chapel, very proud of their t-shirts they were wearing. These are street kids. Kids who might be fodder for gangs. They wore t-shirts with kind of a muscle man on them. A muscle man with a crown of thorns on his head. And the t-shirt read, "Jesus is my homeboy." I wasn't sure what I should think of that. I went from being overjoyed to being enraged and back again. What I realized is that those kids needed to have Jesus as their homeboy. They didn't need the transcendent God light years away. They needed the God who walked with them the dark streets of New York. On the other hand, I think, that's kind of an interesting thing. I guess some songs are just swaying songs. I have enough German in my background that I don't sway until I've had at least 4 pints of beer. But, yes, sir.
I noticed at Lenten Church, when somebody has special music,
Yeah.
I feel moved by that. I want to applaud that.
Yeah, that's interesting. That self-same question actually came up at the Men's Fellowship breakfast this past Saturday. We tend not to be clappers in the Lutheran Church. And the reason has something to do with this issue, actually everything has something to do with this issue of transcendence for sins. Our worship, in theory, is all about God. Our worship is what we do for God, as opposed to what the people are doing for us. So although we may appreciate the music, it may even entertain us, that should be at best and at most a latent effect, not the primary effect. And by applauding the way we would at a concert, we sort of change the focus from God being glorified to the performers being appreciated. And it's not wrong to appreciate the performers, but since we're in a liturgical environment, all of our actions become part of the work of the people. By the way, I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just giving you the text of the answer. Any other questions? Okay, let's go ahead and move to our devotional portion of the morning here. Because actually, I know we started to sway soon.